Okay, so this is not quite 5 minutes, but imagine it is 5 minutes. The longer this sits, the easier it's going to be for you to handle. And especially in the beginning, I think it's helpful for people to write times on there, just because it feels like 5 minutes doesn't mean it's been 5 minutes. It could have been 2 minutes. Make sure you time yourself so that you have a good idea of what that 5 minutes is like. The wetter the dough, the stickier it is. Maybe if you haven't done a good job mixing, it's going to be better that it sits longer. I'd say nothing past 10 minutes, because what's happening is the yeast is becoming active and it's starting to ferment. And so that's kind of starting this clock, this running clock that we have to pay attention to, because if dough sits for too long, then it becomes over fermented, and that changes the flavor. It's nothing that you have to pay attention to every little minute, but if this is sitting out for like 30 minutes and then you come back to it and then you let it ferment for another hour and a half, you know, it adds up quickly. For us, because we have to be done in 4 hours, we're paying pretty close attention to it. But if you were, say, doing lots of other things in the meantime and you lost track of it, you don't want this sitting for a long time. So what you're going to do is you're going to pick it up and you're going to start to knead this. And so what this looks like is you fold it in half and you roll it away from you. So you can do this 2 ways. You can do it with your thumbs, like a little bar that you push across. Once this becomes less sticky, then you can use the palm of your hand. But I find sometimes in the beginning, it might be easier with really sticky and wet doughs. It's easier to use your thumbs because there's less contact with the dough, so less sticks to it. So what you're doing is you're folding it in half, and then you're pressing down on the seam right here. Let's see if I can do this backwards. And then as you roll it away, it's probably going to stick. So what you have to do is go faster, and you'll see that the dough comes with it. So turning it back around to my right side. So I fold it in half and I roll away. At this point, because I'm mixing this correctly, it's quickly getting nice and smooth, and it's not nearly as sticky. I'll promise you this, it's not going to be that easy tomorrow. It's going to be everywhere. It's not going to seem as easy as it does right now as you're watching it. So some of that just takes some time and handling, but you get direct feedback from your dough. If it doesn't look like this quickly, it means you're doing something wrong. So I'll be walking around and helping you with all of it, but you'll have a pretty good idea whether you're doing it right or not. So the 2 important pieces here is that the seam is always face up. If I suddenly turn this dough over and start going this way, I'm basically undoing everything I just did, and so it's going to start to go from smooth to sticky and rough again. So seam side always stays up, and then as you fold it in half, as you're rolling away, you want to put a little bit of pressure on there. Not pressure in one space that you tear the dough, but just general pressure so that it gets longer. So when you flip the dough, it's a lot easier to fold in half. What you'll find is if you don't really do that, then this dough gets so short, you find yourself having to like pull and stretch. So if I'm pulling and stretching, you can see that I've already torn the dough some. And if you continue to do that, it's also going to prevent this from getting smoother and looking nice or prevent it from, it'll stay sticky. I can't think of a better way to say that. It'll just stay sticky. So what you want to do is be gentle with the dough. Make sure you're not tearing it. Sometimes students will dig their thumbs into the dough. This is pretty common. And that, again, you can see starts to make it look rough again. It's not going to be nice and smooth. So just very gentle pressure. I'm always turning it as I knead it. And then you'll see this get nice and tight. And you can kind of think of it as a rubber band. So if you were to stretch a rubber band, fold it in half, and keep stretching it and folding it in half, it gets tighter and tighter. And that's essentially what gluten strands are. So eventually, this gets nice and tight, and it's basically done mixing. And if you keep mixing, then it starts to just break down. It'd be like the rubber band breaking in half or tearing. In this case with dough, what it looks like is all of a sudden you would start to see, I'll keep going until I start to see a few little tears in the dough. And this has to be after it's gotten nice and smooth, after you've been kneading it for a while, now all of a sudden you see it starting to tear. And if you just kept going, eventually it would get really sticky and wet. And that's basically gluten breaking down, re-releasing water, and then it'll never go back together. So this would happen more so in a mixer necessarily than by hand. But you can see right here where all of this is starting to tear, it looks like just the surface is kind of tearing through. When you start to see that after you've been mixing for a while, that's an indication that it's probably done mixing, maybe a little over-mixed. If you felt like the dough wasn't developed enough, you could always wait, let it relax for a while, another 5 minutes or so, and then go back and develop it some more. But you can see it doesn't take a whole lot of mixing, and it's pretty clear now, all these like rough spots here, that's just dough that's already been mixed for for too long. So at this point it's not going to do anything, but if I kept going and it started to get wet and shiny all of a sudden and really change in characteristic, that would be overmixed. So to tell that it's mixed enough, there's different ways. A lot of bread is just by feel and by look, and you just know when it's done, you know when it's done being proofed, you know it's the right consistency. And so bakers get good just by doing their job day in, day out, the same dough every day. So eventually you know it's done mixing just by feel. And feel would be nice and tight, it's smooth. If you were to press it, it would bounce back right away. The ball of dough feels nice and firm. The other way that you can do this is what's called stretching a gluten window. So I took a fairly big sample. You don't need to take quite this much. But you take a piece of dough and then you gently try to stretch it out to the point that you can see through the dough. You can see it's tearing a little bit, and that's because I just mixed this dough and it needs some more time to relax. But essentially, if this dough was not done being mixed, it would tear right away. I wouldn't be able to get it pulled this far without it tearing. And I'm being pretty gentle, but all I'm looking for is to see that I can get that nice thin window, even if I have tears around there. I know that if this sat for another 5 minutes or so, I could easily pull that without it tearing. But you can, the best way to learn bread is to see the extreme. So when you start mixing, if you tried to pull that gluten window, you'd see that it quickly just broke right apart. You'd never get it elastic enough to even get close to stretching it that thin. So that's probably a good first beginner test for doneness, or if I'm working with a dough I'm unfamiliar with, I'll do that as well, just to see that it's done mixing. Or to be honest, if I lose track of a mixing and I haven't been counting the time, like on a machine, I can stop and do the same thing, pull that gluten window to see how it feels. Okay, so your bowl should be pretty clean, but I usually will go through and just scrape out any excess hard parts so they don't end up in my dough. You don't need a clean bowl, the same one you've been working with is fine. Little pan spray. And this is going to go back into my bowl. So notice I haven't used any bench flour on the table. And while some of you tomorrow might find it's really hard to develop the dough and it's sticky, your inclination is going to be to grab some bench flour so it doesn't stick to you. But that's just adding more flour to your formula, so you don't want to do it at this point. From this point on, then you use flour, because at that point it's just staying on the outside, it's not getting mixed into the dough. But while you're still developing the dough, no flour. So from here, it's going to need to sit, and it's in fermentation stage. And again, I'll talk about this in a second, but it's going to sit for about 45 minutes. And basically double in size. So I usually like to write what dough this is, because if you get more than one white dough, it can be confusing. What dough it is, and then the time I started mixing it, or finished mixing it, sorry. Just so I have an idea. But one of the most important things to remember about bread is it's not exact. You can't just say, okay, I've waited 45 minutes, this is going to be done. Because we've got living organisms at play here, things that move faster or slower given their conditions. So if it's really cold, it's going to move slower. If it's really warm, it'll move faster. So 45 minutes isn't going to always be the right amount of time. For this dough, because we're all using the same temperature, the same yeast, the same amount of yeast, about 45 minutes till it doubles. And when it doubles, I've got one that's been sitting even longer than that. It's been about an hour and 10, 20 minutes. So you can see that this has gotten pretty big. It doesn't get twice as high, it gets flat because it's in a big bowl. So it's hard to tell exactly what double is. Some people will draw like circles on the dough so that they see when it gets to be twice as big of a circle. You know, different things are going to help you gauge like as it's grown. But other things are at play too, like how much water is in the dough. A dough that has more water is going to ferment faster than a dough that has less water. So really stiff doughs don't appear to be moving quite as fast. So there's lots of things that would make it maybe double in that 45 minutes. Sometimes it's not quite there. But the next step that we're going to go through is what's called the punch and fold. So has anybody ever made bread at home?
Well, no.
Or here? I mean, oh. So most people, if they've had any prior experience, you know, you like punch the dough and you just get all the air out and you leave it. But that's not really the case. What we're doing is we're expelling the air and then we're kind of tightening it back up for a second rising. So what you're doing is you're relaxing it and you're getting it ready to rise again. So in that time, it's getting more flavor, and it's also strengthening the dough because everything relaxes and then it stretches out again. In that stretching process, it strengthens the gluten. And that's what we're looking for, is to get a nice structure out of our bread, to get a lot of gluten development, and a lot of that happens during the fermentation stage. So now I'm going to do the punch and fold. So imagine this is 45 minutes later. And when you're first learning, you can go by the clock. I just want you to understand, too, that you can't always, like, if somebody has really cold water and you're like, my dough does not look like everybody else's, but it's at 45 minutes, you have to understand that's why. You know, it's not, you can't expect at the 45-minute mark everybody's going to look the same. So when any process after the first development gets flour. So one of the things I want you guys to practice as you have some downtime is dusting a bench. This is one of those things that sets professionals apart from home cooks. And it's just something that helps to speak to the fact that you have some experience. You know, nothing's gonna make you look spectacular your first day, but if you show up prepared, if you show up clean and pressed, and you're doing like things that are evident of professionals, it's gonna help you. And this is the place to try this because it's easy to clean. Right at home, you probably have backsplash, you have things on your counter, everything that can be dusted, and it gets a lot harder to pick this mess up. But what you want to do is take a little bit of flour in your hand, and instead of closing it, have it about half open or so, and you just flick your wrist, and flour just kind of flies out and dusts the bench. So you'll see it's my hand's left open, I'm just flicking my wrist. You want to keep it fairly level and just flick it enough that flour flies out. But go ahead, as you're going about tomorrow, the next day, you know, the first few days, practice that. Because when this becomes really important is later on when you have lots of dough. Say you have a huge bowl full of dough that you're turning out on a bench. You don't want to be going around sprinkling, because what happens is you get big lumps of flour. You want to evenly dust it, and then you want to be able to dust it fast. So if I was doing a lot of dough, I could get a big handful of flour and really toss it. I don't want to cover you, but I could really toss it, and then I could dust a much longer bench very quickly, and that's really the reason behind it. I don't need quite as much flour for one little dough. And it also, my dough is not that sticky, so you have to put as much as your dough needs. So really wet doughs, I would dust it heavier. This dough is really not sticky, so I'm not going to put a lot of